Welcome to another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. My name is Steve Fielding. All the stories are taken from my 3-volume series of books, The Hangman's Record, covering every execution in Great Britain and Ireland between 1868 and 1964. Copies of these and many of my other titles can be obtained through my website, stevefielding.com. If you enjoy the video, can you please press like and subscribe to the channel, and if you can spare £1 or £2 to help it to continue to grow by clicking the thanks button on the YouTube video or the link paypal.me/The Hangman's Record, that will be greatly appreciated. And, as always, use the comments below for your thoughts on the case, whether justice was seen to be done, and suggestions for future episodes in this series. In several episodes of Tales from the Hangman's Record, we have looked at cases that went to trial post-1957 and came under the scope of the Homicide Act. The new law was meant to separate those that would be hanged and those sent to prison for life. And while the Act did mean that many, like a spurned lover or a poorly educated person killing an unplanned and unwanted baby, and who would have otherwise been hanged prior to the Act being passed, being spared the rope, it did, as we shall discover, cause more problems than it solved. 1957 opened in the UK with the resignation of Prime Minister Anthony Eden due to ill health, being replaced by Harold Macmillan. Queen Elizabeth II is starting the 5th year of her reign, and in America, Dwight D. Eisenhower is halfway through his 8 years in the White House. It was a year that was to see the deaths of actors Humphrey Bogart and Oliver Hardy, and also crime author Dorothy L. Sayers and Eliot Ness, head of the prohibition agents, the Untouchables. The Cavern in Liverpool opens as a jazz club, and a few months later, at a garden fete across the city of Liverpool, future Beatles John Lennon and Paul McCartney meet for the first time. The music charts are still dominated by American artists, with Pat Boone, Fats Domino, Little Richard and Elvis Presley, plus many others all having #1 hits. In literature, 1957 was to see the publication of Agatha Christie's 450 from Paddington, John Wyndham's Midwich Cuckoos, and Ian Fleming's From Russia with Love. And, after almost 2 years in abeyance, capital punishment returns to Great Britain and the newly appointed hangmen go to work. By the 1950s, there was a general shift in the mindset that capital punishment had had its day. Previously, in both 1930 and 1948, Parliament had looked into whether to abolish the death penalty or to modernise and change the mode of execution from hanging to one of the American methods deemed more humane. One of the outcomes of the second of these debates was the setting up of the Royal Commission report. Published in 1953, although this legislated a few changes to the execution protocol, the death penalty more or less continued as it was before, retaining hanging as the preferred method with just a few tweaks to things like how hangmen were employed and the ending of double executions. It was always a political issue too, with opposing sides of the House generally holding different opinions on abolition or retention, with the left the former and the right the latter. The outcry following the high-profile and controversial cases from the early 1950s concerning Derek Bentley and Christopher Craig, and then the Rillington Place murders by John Christie, which suggested that Timothy Evans may have gone to the gallows for a crime committed by Christie, came to a head with the hanging of Ruth Ellis in July 1955. Less than a month later, on the 12th of August, Alec Wilkinson was hanged at Leeds Prison for the murder of his mother-in-law, who he stabbed to death with a bread knife. Over the next few months, both of the country's senior executioners, Albert Pierpont and Steve Wade, left the list. Wade was pensioned off at the end of the year due to his failing eyesight, and following a dispute over expenses, Pierpont wrote his resignation letter in February 1956. Although newly promoted hangman Harry Allen was to receive over 30 letters offering engagements as a chief executioner from January 1956 onwards, all were cancelled, with no executions taking place while Parliament debated whether to abolish or limit the crimes that would carry the death penalty. As a result, there was nobody hanged in 1956, possibly the only year in history up to that time that capital punishment wasn't used in Great Britain. The outcome of this debate on the death penalty was the Homicide Act, which became law on Thursday, the 21st of March 1957. Now, convicted murderers face a death penalty if they were found guilty of capital murder, which in most cases was during the course or furtherance of theft. Despite her advancing years and ailments that included deafness and heart trouble, 83-year-old widow Mrs. Selina Mewes still earned a living as a moneylender. Regarded as an eccentric, there were few people in the Elswick district of Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England who did not know Mrs. Money as she was known. Local rumour held that Mrs. Mewes was a very wealthy woman, and it was known she owned many properties in Warncliffe Street, a row of large terrace houses off the busy Scotswood Road running along the north side of the River Tyne. Finding it difficult to negotiate the stairs at her home at 16 Warncliffe Road, she now rented out the upper 2 rooms and one downstairs to lodgers, living and sleeping in one ground floor room with her dog Rex. A number of times over recent months, the local police have been called to the house where the old lady had been burgled. The most recent had taken place on Friday the 1st of March 1957, when a thief had broken in and robbed her of over £90. At 8:30 on Tuesday morning the 5th of March, Newcastle police received a telephone call informing them of another break-in at 16 Warncliffe Street. Arriving at the soon-to-be-demolished street, officers were shown into the downstairs room where they were greeted with a horrific sight. The frail old lady lay on the bed, covered in blood-soaked bedding, having been beaten around the head. Detectives under the command of Detective Superintendent Robert Davidson were tasked with handling the investigation. Accompanied by Detective Chief Inspector James Angus, Davidson made his way to the house, where he was joined by the counter-pathologist George Stevenson. Stevenson told detectives he believed that Mrs. Mewes had been sleeping when attacked, as her head was covered in a blood-soaked blanket that appeared to have been pulled up over her face. In light of the previous incidents at the house, detectives were convinced that robbery was again the motive. Police learned that although Selina Mewes had numerous callers daily to borrow money, she was very fussy about who she would invite into the house. None of the lodgers or tenants claimed to have ever been in her room, and she would conduct her money-lending business through a window to hand out or collect the money. They also learned that during an average week, she would do business with up to 100 people, many of them young men. As the police set up the incident room and called their first briefing, detectives quickly realised that due to the nature of her business, there could be scores of suspects. One team of detectives began to go through her papers, aiming to compile a list of clients who had borrowed money, while others began to check for young men who had been acting suspiciously in the area and may have left their lodgings or workplace in a hurry. It was then something of a surprise that Superintendent Davidson had a suspect charged and in custody within 24 hours of the incident being reported. Later that day, a man walked into the police station on Pilgrim Street and approached the counter. "There's been a murder in Scotswood Road this morning." 17-year-old police cadet Francis Mavin was on duty in the station behind the desk. "Well," he asked, "I want to admit to it." The stunned cadet called the CID office and 2 officers came down and placed the man under arrest. The man gave his name as Ronald Patrick Dunbar. He was 24 years old and lived with his wife Mary and 2 young daughters in nearby Plummer Street. Known to his family and friends as Ronnie, Dunbar was a local man who had left school at 15. He'd had over a score of semi-skilled jobs. In the previous year, he'd been working as a labourer and lodging at a property owned by the dead woman. 3 months ago, the family had moved to new lodgings in Plummer Street, a 5-minute walk from the scene of the murder, again a property owned by the dead woman. Under questioning, Dunbar admitted that a few days earlier, on Friday the 1st of March, he had broken into Mrs. Mewes' room and stolen almost £90. As he had avoided detection and found it such an easy job, he decided to return to repeat the burglary. Describing the murder of Mrs. Mewes, Dunbar told the police he had broken in via a downstairs window and made his way to the front of the house. I thought she recognised me, so I picked up a Tizer bottle which was on the table beside the bed and hit her on the head with it. Then I took a few shillings from under the pillow. I then panicked and ran home. Dunbar said that when he arrived back at his lodgings, his wife was in bed. I just undressed and climbed into bed. This morning, when the wife went on to Scotswood Road for some milk, she came back and told me Mrs. Mewes was dead. I told her I had done it. The details leading up to the murder were revealed when Ronald Dunbar appeared before Mr. Justice Ashworth at Newcastle Moot Hall on Wednesday the 15th of May. Geoffrey Veal QC led for the prosecution, with Dunbar's defence led by Peter Stanley Price QC. Opening for the Crown, Veal addressed the jury. The prosecution submit that this is a dastardly and brutal murder, as one can well imagine, because it is the killing of an old lady of 82 in her bed, when she surprised this man who had broken into her house in the middle of the night, ransacking the house in order to steal. Veal said that the doctor who did the post-mortem thinks there must have been 5 or 6 separate blows. There was blood on the wall, the skirting board, and all over the floor. Stanley Price told the court that Dunbar's defence was that he had killed the old woman while suffering from diminished responsibility, so his crime could be reduced as one of manslaughter. He said that the facts of the case were not in dispute, and in Dunbar's own words, he went to the house to screw the place. Dunbar said that on the night of the murder he had met up with his friend Alexander Curry in a local pub at about 6:30. After consuming many pints of beer and several rum chasers, the two men left the pub at around 9 o'clock. Dunbar had then become involved in an argument in the street with a stranger and started brandishing a flick knife. They had planned to steal a bayonet from a house in Plummer Street, but they were disturbed when the neighbour came out to investigate the noise. Dunbar had left his cap and gloves behind and then threatened Curry with a flick knife if he did not go back and retrieve them. Fortunately for Curry, the owner threw them over the wall. The glove was later found by the police on the lawn outside the house. Following this incident, Curry decided he wanted no further part in Dunbar's plans to commit the robbery and fled the scene. Evidence was presented to show that at 9:10, Dunbar entered Mrs. Mewes' house and began to ransack the bedroom. Then, to his horror, she awoke, and fearing he would be recognised, Dunbar said he struck her several times with a bottle, having first covered her face with bedclothes. In his confession following his surrender to the police, Dunbar told detectives he could not face hitting the whole lady without first covering her face. He had then fled after taking several 10-shilling notes. Stanley Price told the court that Dunbar did not want to go to the police, as when his wife said he would be caught, he then went straight to the station. He read Dunbar's statement to the police, which said, "When I decided to give myself up to the police, I told my wife to hide the money, thinking it would help her while I was away." The money was located in the cellar of the house. The defence called evidence included the medical officer at Durham prison, Dr. Ian Pickering, who said he had interviewed Dunbar immediately after his confession and found he was a normal young man of 24 with an IQ of 112. Another doctor, Robert Orton, said he had given the accused 3.5 pints of beer while conducting an electroencephalogram test, which, while he found no significant results to the beer test on the prisoner, he did claim that Dunbar was an inadequate psychopath. Dr. Pickering said that when he interviewed Dunbar, he was rational, fully understood what he had done, and was deeply worried about what would happen to him. The typical psychopath remains indifferent, said the doctor. In the Crown summing up, Veal said, "This is a case of a burglar committing his crime and battering to death a witness that he thinks has recognised him." In his summing up, Mr. Justice Ashworth said that diminished responsibility was not a soft option to murder, and the fact that Dunbar had been drinking was no defence either. Abnormality could not be self-induced. The onus of proof was on the defence to show any peculiarities due to retarded development or any inherent injuries or diseases. It is not enough for a man to say, "I am queer, abnormal, odd, and therefore I cannot be guilty of murder." The law does not say that. It says that the abnormality must be such to impair substantial mental responsibility. At the end of the trial, on the 16th of May, the jury, including 4 women, retired for just 75 minutes. Finding Dunbar guilty, Mr. Ashworth fully concurred with the jury's decision. Asked if he had anything to say before sentence of death was passed, Dunbar requested that the public gallery be cleared of his relatives. However, the judge said it was not possible, and there was audible weeps as Dunbar was told he would suffer death by hanging. He was returned to Durham prison, this time to the condemned cell, with his execution set for Thursday the 6th of June. Dunbar chose to appeal his sentence, and the execution date was then postponed, subject to an appeal scheduled to be heard at the Court of Criminal Appeal in London. The general store on Tate Street, Carlisle, Cumbria, in the north of England, seemed an easy target. 72-year-old spinster Jane Duckett lived alone above the shop and was partially deaf. The plan was simple. The 22-year-old thief had it all worked out. He would break in, steal the money he knew she kept in the basement, and make good his escape. At 2 o'clock on the morning of Monday, the 15th of April 1957, he carried out the simple plan, gained entry to the shop, and headed straight for the cellar. There were, however, just a couple of slight problems. Firstly, the money was not as easy to get as he had surmised, and secondly, Jane Duckett was not as deaf as he had been led to believe. As he rummaged through the darkened cellar, she heard the disturbance, and dressed only in her nightgown, she descended the stairs to investigate. Hearing her footsteps, the thief hid behind the stairs, hoping she would not see him. Problem number 3 began when she discovered the intruder raised her arms and charged at him, fist flailing wildly. The man panicked. He struck out and hit the old lady with several blows. As she slumped to the floor, he kicked her a number of times in the face before ransacking the house in a vain search for the money. He then fled empty-handed. Detectives were alerted to the crime when a neighbour spotted the blinds were drawn and the milk bottles on the step on the following morning. Going to investigate, an officer forced the back door and found Jane Duckett lying at the foot of the cellar stairs. She died from her injuries a few hours later. Under the command of Deputy Chief Constable Fred Blacklock, they soon had a man charged with murder. Labourer John Willson Vickers, a native of Penrith, and who lodged close to the shop at 10 Allegombe Street, was well known to the police, and they soon tracked down the petty criminal. He had actually already been arrested for stealing a car mirror on the same day as the body was discovered, and was held in custody when interviewed about the murder. He damned himself in his opening statement. Vickers said he had entered the premises in order to carry out a robbery, and although he admitted striking the woman, he claimed it was in self-defence, that he did not intend to kill her. "I did it, and I don't know what possessed me to do it." The scratches on his face supported his story that the old lady had attacked him. Vickers made a number of detailed statements admitting the attack on the old woman. "I have been cautioned that I am not obliged to say anything unless I wish to do so, and that anything I do say will be taken down in writing and may be given in evidence, and I wish Detective Sergeant Armstrong to write it down for me. Some of the things I told you yesterday were not true. I walked down Tate Street, and when I got to Mrs. Duckett's, I thought I would get in to get some money. I thought about doing it a lot, once or twice, and I've told my pal that I would like to get some money from there. I kicked the cellar window in with my left foot, then pushed the catch back, and the window fell down and broke another pane of glass. I climbed through into the cellar, went through the door and up the stairs, but I heard someone walking along the passage and saw Mrs. Duckett coming down. There was a light somewhere upstairs, and I hid behind the stairs. She was in a nightdress. She went into the cellar and saw me. I was nervous. She said, 'What's going on down here? What are you doing here?' I went towards her and she seemed to come at me, so I pushed her. I shoved her backwards and then I hit her with my fist. I hit her once and she fell to the ground. I don't know how many times, only once or twice. I left her there and went up the stairs into the living room. There was a light on. I had a look in the sideboard, I think. I pulled the drawer and it fell out. I didn't take anything. Then I went into the shop, had a look around for money but couldn't find any. After that I went upstairs. It was dark but I switched the light on. I went to the 2 bedrooms, had a look for money but didn't find any. After that I came downstairs and couldn't be sure which way to get out, whether to go through the window of the cellar or the front door. Really, I cannot remember whether I went down to the cellar again or not. But I know I went by the front door because I had to pull 2 bolts. I went home to number 10 and went to the kitchen. I ironed my tie because it was crumpled up. I think by Mrs. Duckett. Then I saw there was some blood on my pullover, so I washed it. Later I went to bed. I'm sorry I did this to Mrs. Duckett. I only meant to get some money, and I didn't think I would hurt her. It was a surprise. I did panic. I wish I'd never done it. I should have known it was silly because I tried a few weeks ago to get the cellar grid open with a rake. I stopped that time, and I should have stopped on Sunday. Held on remand, Vickers was then visited by a mother he had last seen when she had given him up for adoption as a baby. Although he had been brought up by his father's parents when the couple broke up, his father had died early in the new year. Now remarried and with 11 other children, 45-year-old Florence Lesser had only found out the fate of her firstborn when she was called by a relative. "The boy didn't ask to see me, but I thought as a mother I should stand by him," she told a reporter who spoke to her at her home in Penrith. She brought him cigarettes, and as she had no photograph of him, she asked the police for a copy of the mugshot they had taken. Tried before Mr Justice Hinchcliffe at Cumberland Assizes on the 23rd of May, Vickers faced a charge of capital murder. The prosecution was led by Daniel Brabbin QC, with Jack Divinayam QC handling Vickers' defence. The main issue wasn't so much that Vickers had caused the death of Mrs Duckett, but more his defence was that no theft had actually taken place, so it should be the lesser charge of non-capital murder. It now came down to interpretation of the law. The prosecution claimed that as Vickers had admitted he had entered the premises to steal, it was therefore in the furtherance of theft. And so it was on Thursday the 23rd of May, John Vickers was found guilty of capital murder and duly sentenced to death. An execution date was set for Thursday the 13th of June. In the past, John Vickers would have been hanged alongside Ronald Dunbar, as prisons often sanctioned double executions when they had two men in the condemned cells, partly to save on employing the hangman to travel to the prison on 2 occasions. But, as we heard in the introduction, one of the changes to the protocol following the Royal Commission was the ending of double executions. Like Ronald Dunbar, John Vickers chose to appeal his conviction, and both men were taken from the condemned cells at Durham down to London to hear the appeals. On Monday the 1st of July, 3 appeal judges, Lord Chief Justice Goddard and Mr Justice Byrne and Devlin, heard Dunbar's legal team rule that he was suffering from diminished responsibility and therefore only guilty of manslaughter. It was decided that since the appeal involved such a contentious matter, it should be heard by all 5 appeal judges and was therefore postponed to allow a new panel to be put together. The guilty verdict against John Vickers had also raised a point of law which was heard at his appeal. This new law seemed to imply that if there was no malice of forethought, it could not be murder. Therefore, as with Dunbar, the appeal court thought that this point of law was so crucial that they adjourned this appeal and resat with a panel of 5 instead of the customary 3. Both men were then housed in a London prison prior to the rescheduled appeals. Dunbar's was heard first. On Friday the 5th of July, the new panel, which included Justices Slade and Hilbery, heard the appeal from Dunbar's counsel. Reaching their verdict, Lord Chief Goddard said that they were allowing the appeal. Goddard said that while the trial judge had stated that the onus of proof of diminished responsibility lay with the defence, the degree of proof was not as great as when the prosecution alleged murder. Since Mr Justice Ashworth did not relay this to the jury, and since it was a capital case, it would now be impossible for the appeal court to be satisfied that a miscarriage of justice may not have happened. They concurred with the original court decision that he was guilty, but found he was now guilty of manslaughter, as it was established the degree of proof required by the defence to establish diminished responsibility had been proven. Thus the capital charge was overturned. Dunbar was sentenced to life imprisonment, with all 5 judges agreeing that the prisoner was a dangerous psychopath who should only be released when the authorities felt he would not be a danger to the public. John Vickers' appeal later that afternoon was on the grounds that the defence said that the trial judge had misdirected the jury on the question of malice aforethought required for murder, and since the passing of the Homicide Act, the law of murder was unclear. In his summing up on this case, Lord Goddard said that if a person does an act which amounts to an infliction of grievous bodily harm, he cannot say he only intended to cause a certain degree of harm. If he intended to inflict grievous bodily harm when that person dies, that has always been held in English law, and was at the time of the Homicide Act, sufficient to imply the malice aforethought, which is a necessary constituent of murder. It is termed malum in se, and he must take the consequences. Dismissing this appeal, all 5 judges endorsed the trial judge and it was explained that as the accused had inflicted grievous bodily harm, and that violence led to death, the person was guilty of capital murder. Whether he stole money or not, the intention to rob was still there. Vickers was returned to the condemned cell at Durham, as great efforts went into finding a way to maintain the moratorium and stop executions taking place. On Friday the 12th of July, Attorney General Sir Reginald Manningham Buller refused an appeal to the House of Lords, which caused him to be the subject of a motion by 68 Labour MPs censuring him in the House of Commons. In response, he made a brief statement to the House. "I can grant a certificate of appeal to the Lords if the criminal appeal involves a point of law of exceptional importance, but on this occasion I was unable to reach the conclusion that this condition was satisfied." Unlike Patrick Dunbar's case, there was no question of diminished responsibility or insanity, and John Willson Vickers, at 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning the 23rd of July, was hanged at Durham Prison by Harry Allen and assistant Harry Smith. It was the first execution carried out under the Homicide Act, and Harry Allen's first duty as a number one. Outside the prison gates, a vigil was kept throughout the night by a large crowd including 6 MPs until the fateful hour approached. Under the Homicide Act, the notice of execution was no longer placed on the prison gate, and it fell to the Home Secretary, Richard Butler, to publish in a manner he felt fit the fact an execution had taken place. Ronald Patrick Dunbar was released from prison in 1968, having served 11 years. However, he was subsequently recalled on a number of occasions and served another 5.5 years and was finally released in 1976. He died on the 23rd of January 2002, 45 years after his death sentence was postponed. In England and Scotland, 70 men and 1 woman were condemned to death for capital murder between 1957 and Tuesday the 9th of November 1965, when the death penalty was abolished for murder. And, like the capital sentences passed on Dunbar and Vickers, 2/3 were for murder done in the course or furtherance of theft. Two very similar crimes, two very different outcomes. The Homicide Act, as we have seen, was very controversial, and throughout the next 8 years there were a number of incidents where one person was reprieved for the same offence that saw another go to the gallows. What was meant to make things clearer in regards to capital punishment simply made them confusing and inconsistent, and was probably one of the reasons that the death penalty was abolished in 1965. You'll be watching another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. Until the next time, thank you and goodbye.